"Sir, why do you eat alone every night?" a waitress asked a Millionaire CEO. His answer froze her. His name was Lucas Hale. The question came out louder than she meant to, and the moment it did, the entire restaurant went silent. Lucas slowly looked up from his plate. For a brief second, he didn't answer. He just stared at the empty chair across from him, like it held a story no one else could see. People expected him to ignore her, or shut the moment down. Instead, he did something no one was ready for. He placed his fork on the table, lifted his eyes to hers, and spoke calmly, almost gently. But the words he chose landed heavier than anyone expected, because that answer wasn't just an explanation. It was the beginning of something no one in that room was prepared for. And once he spoke, nothing between them would stay the same. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything. Lucas Hale wasn't just another customer at the restaurant. He was the kind of man people noticed without trying to. The tailored jacket, the calm posture, the way staff instinctively treated him with extra care. He came in every night at the same time, paid in cash, tipped generously in dollars, and never once looked at his phone while eating. No calls, no texts, no distractions. Just him, his plate, and the empty chair across the table. The restaurant itself was a popular spot for executives and investors who liked to feel important without being loud about it. Deals were whispered over wine glasses. Laughter came easy at most tables. Yet Lucas always chose the same quiet corner by the window, far from the noise. Some assumed he was antisocial. Others thought he was hiding from something. No one ever asked him directly, until that night. Emily Carter was new, still memorizing table numbers and trying not to look overwhelmed. At 31, she carried herself with quiet strength, the kind built from years of responsibility. A single mother doing double shifts, counting every dollar, balancing exhaustion with hope. She wasn't reckless or nosy by nature, but something about Lucas felt different. Not lonely in a sad way, lonely in a deliberate way. As she walked away after the question, her heart kept racing. She replayed the moment in her head, wondering if she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Customers stared at her. A coworker whispered her name under their breath. She focused on her next table, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured water. Whatever she had stirred up wasn't settling down. Lucas watched her from his seat without being obvious. He noticed the way she moved quickly but carefully, how she listened when people spoke. He had spent years reading boardrooms and balance sheets, but this was different. This wasn't about control or strategy. It was about timing, and timing, he knew, was everything when a life was already worn thin. He finished his meal like always, slow and intentional. When the check arrived, he slid his cash under the folder, added a tip larger than usual, and paused. He looked again at the empty chair, then toward the direction Emily had disappeared. Something in him had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to matter. He hadn't felt that sensation in years. Emily kept working until the end of her shift, but her mind wasn't there. She thought about her son waiting at home, about rent due soon, about choices she didn't feel brave enough to make anymore. The question she asked Lucas had come from somewhere honest, and honesty always carries a cost. She didn't know yet what that cost would be. Lucas stood up to leave, nodded politely to the staff, and walked out into the cold night air. The city moved around him, unaware that something subtle had cracked open inside him. He didn't know what he would say next time he saw her, only that whatever it was, it would change the shape of both their days. And Emily, cleaning her last table, had no idea that the silence she broke had already set something in motion that wouldn't wait for her to feel ready. Lucas waited until Emily returned to his table, her posture professional, but her eyes still carrying the echo of what she had done. She apologized quietly if she had been inappropriate, already preparing herself for a polite dismissal or a cold reaction. Instead, Lucas looked at her with an unexpected calm, as if her question had given him permission to finally speak out loud, something he had rehearsed in silence for years. His voice stayed low, steady, and free of judgment. He told her that he hadn't been offended, that he had actually been waiting for that moment longer than she could imagine. Emily laughed nervously, unsure how to respond, and tried to brush it off as an awkward mistake made on her first week. Lucas didn't let the moment pass. He leaned back slightly, looked her straight in the eyes, and said something that made her stop breathing for a second. He told her that if she wanted, she could ask for her check immediately and leave the restaurant right then. Emily blinked, confused, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Before she could apologize again, he continued, explaining that she would have a guaranteed job waiting for her at his company the next morning. No interview, no waiting list, no strings attached, just an offer. The words sounded unreal, almost inappropriate, like something out of a story people tell to feel better about life. Emily felt heat rise to her face as 1,000 thoughts collided at once. Bills, daycare, rent, groceries, responsibility. She thought about how many times life had taught her not to trust sudden generosity. Her instinct was to protect herself, not to hope. She thanked him, her voice polite but guarded, and told him she couldn't do that. Not tonight, not like this. She explained she needed her job, that walking away without certainty felt irresponsible. Lucas listened without interrupting, without pushing, without disappointment. He simply nodded, as if he had expected that answer all along. Emily walked away feeling both relieved and unsettled. She told herself she had done the right thing, the safe thing, the adult thing. But something about the way Lucas had spoken stayed with her. He hadn't sounded impulsive or arrogant. He sounded intentional, like a man who had already counted the cost of his words. Lucas watched her return to work, noticing the way her shoulders straightened as she moved back into routine. He didn't feel rejected. He felt clarity. The offer hadn't been a test or a trick. It had been a door, and doors, he knew, couldn't be forced open. They could only be left unlocked. As he finished his meal that night, Lucas realized something had already changed, even though Emily had said no. The question she asked had broken a pattern he'd lived inside for years, and now that pattern was unstable. The quiet he had chosen no longer felt the same. Emily closed the restaurant that night with a strange weight in her chest. She replayed his words during the drive home, during dinner with her son, and while staring at the ceiling in the dark. The offer hadn't disappeared just because she'd refused it. It was waiting, and so was the choice she knew she hadn't really made yet. That night, Emily drove home slower than usual, not because of traffic, but because her thoughts refused to line up neatly. The city lights blurred past her windshield while her mind replayed Lucas's words again and again, searching for hidden motives that might justify saying no. She had learned the hard way that sudden kindness often came with expectation, and expectations were dangerous when you had a child depending on you. By the time she parked outside her small apartment, she felt exhausted in a way sleep wouldn't fix. Inside, her son was already asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that reminded her why safety had always come before dreams. She sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by unopened mail and a half-written grocery list, and allowed herself to feel the fear she had pushed aside at the restaurant. The idea of leaving a stable paycheck, even a small one, felt reckless. She had rebuilt her life once already after her marriage fell apart, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to start over again. Lucas, meanwhile, stood alone in his penthouse apartment, looking out at the city from a height most people only dreamed of reaching. The silence there was louder than any restaurant had been, filled with memories he rarely let surface. 5 years had passed since his wife's death, but grief didn't follow a schedule, and some nights it felt closer than others. He had filled his days with work, not to escape pain, but to avoid stillness. He poured himself a glass of water and left it untouched, thinking about the look in Emily's eyes when he made the offer. It hadn't been greed or excitement that flashed there, but fear mixed with responsibility. That reaction stayed with him because it was honest, and honesty had become rare in his world. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his carefully controlled routines were protecting him or quietly isolating him from life. The following evening, Emily returned to the restaurant with a knot in her stomach. She told herself she would act normal, do her job, and forget the entire interaction. But when Lucas walked in and took his usual seat, her pulse quickened, despite her efforts to stay calm. She realized that even saying no had not closed the door emotionally. It had only delayed the moment she would have to face what she truly wanted. Lucas noticed her hesitation when she approached his table, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He didn't mention the offer right away, choosing instead to ask how her shift was going and whether she had slept well. The small talk felt surprisingly intimate, as if both of them were aware they were standing at the edge of something fragile. He sensed that pushing her now would only deepen her fear, and patience, he knew, was a form of kindness too. As the night went on, Emily moved through the restaurant in a quiet fog, half present and half somewhere else entirely. She questioned her instincts, wondering if she had become too cautious, too afraid of hope. Her life had taught her to survive, but survival wasn't the same as living. And the more she tried to ignore Lucas's presence, the more she felt the weight of the choice waiting for her. Lucas finished his meal without mentioning the job again, but something subtle had shifted in him as well. For years, he had believed solitude was a consequence of loss, something permanent and unavoidable. Now, for the first time, he wondered if it had also been a decision he kept making out of habit, and that realization unsettled him more than loneliness ever had. By the end of that night, both of them returned to their separate lives feeling exposed and uncertain. Emily felt as if a safety net she relied on was slowly unraveling, while Lucas sensed that the walls he built around himself were beginning to crack. Neither of them knew what the next step would be. They only knew that standing still no longer felt possible. On the third night, Lucas arrived at the restaurant at the same time as always, expecting nothing more than a familiar routine that usually required no emotional effort. He took his seat by the window, placed his jacket on the back of the chair, and scanned the room with a neutral expression. The atmosphere felt slightly off, though he couldn't immediately explain why. The hum of conversation seemed louder, less contained, as if the room itself was holding its breath. He waited, assuming Emily would appear any second. A different waiter approached the table with a practiced smile and handed Lucas the menu without comment. Lucas accepted it, but his eyes followed the waiter for a moment longer than necessary. He glanced toward the service area, then toward the bar, subtly searching for someone he hadn't planned on missing. The absence registered slowly, like a missing note in a familiar song. After a brief pause, Lucas looked back at the waiter and asked, calmly and without urgency, where Emily was that night. The waiter answered casually, unaware of the weight the words would carry. He said she had asked for her check at the end of her shift the night before and hadn't come back. Lucas nodded, thanked him, and returned his attention to the menu. But the words echoed louder than expected. Something about the finality of that statement landed differently than Emily's hesitation had. This wasn't uncertainty anymore. This was action. Lucas sat there longer than usual, barely noticing the menu in front of him. He replayed the previous nights in his head, wondering if he had misread her fear as interest or her silence as permission. He questioned whether the offer he made had been generous or unfair, kind or disruptive. For the first time, doubt crept into a decision he had believed was thoughtful. He ordered anyway, more out of habit than hunger. Several minutes passed before movement near the entrance caught his attention. Lucas looked up without expectation, and that was when he saw Emily. She wasn't carrying a tray, and she wasn't moving with the urgency of someone on shift. She walked with intention, her posture steady, her expression composed in a way Lucas hadn't seen before. Without asking, without hesitation, she approached the table and pulled out the empty chair. Emily sat down across from him, placing her hands calmly on the table as if this was exactly where she was meant to be. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background as their eyes met. No explanation followed, and none was needed. The decision she hadn't been ready to make before had clearly been made. Lucas felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized he'd been holding tight. They sat in silence for a moment, not awkward, but charged with understanding. Emily finally spoke, explaining simply that she had thought about his offer all night, and then all day, and realized she was more afraid of staying stuck than of starting over. She admitted that quitting had terrified her, but pretending nothing had happened felt worse. Lucas listened without interrupting, recognizing courage when he saw it. The fear in her voice wasn't weakness, it was honesty. Lucas told her he respected the risk she had taken, and that he hadn't expected her to come back like this. He admitted that her question had forced him to confront choices he'd been avoiding for years. This wasn't about charity or control, he said, but about timing and trust. Emily nodded, understanding that the weight of the moment went both ways. What had begun as a simple question had now become a shared turning point. As their food arrived, untouched for several minutes, both of them sensed that the evening marked a line they could not step back over. This wasn't a job offer anymore. It wasn't curiosity or coincidence. It was the start of something undefined but real, something that demanded intention from both sides. and neither of them yet knew how far this decision would carry them. Lucas didn't rush the conversation that night, even though he felt the weight of what Emily's decision represented. Instead of pressing her with questions or promises, he chose to listen, allowing her to explain her life in her own rhythm. Emily spoke about becoming a mother earlier than planned, about how love had once felt safe until it slowly turned uncertain. She explained how walking away from her marriage had been necessary, but deeply painful, leaving her cautious around sudden kindness. Lucas absorbed every word, understanding that trust could not be demanded, only earned. Rather than talking about his company, Lucas asked about Emily's skills, her interests, and the life she had, before everything narrowed into survival mode. She hesitated at first, unsure how much to reveal, but eventually told him about her years working as an accountant before stepping away to focus on family. Numbers, she explained, had always made sense to her when emotions did not. She talked about structure, balance, and responsibility, and Lucas recognized competence immediately. This wasn't someone looking for rescue. This was someone looking for a fair chance. The next morning, Lucas kept his word without spectacle or shortcuts. Emily arrived at his company expecting a formality, but instead found a respectful process that treated her like a professional, not a favor. The interview was thorough, focused on experience rather than circumstance, and by the end of it, the decision was obvious. She wasn't being given a job. She was being welcomed back into a world she had once belonged to. That distinction mattered more than either of them said out loud. As weeks passed, Emily proved herself quickly, identifying discrepancies others had overlooked and questioning systems that had gone unchallenged for years. Lucas watched from a distance, careful not to interfere or give the impression of favoritism. He understood that real support meant restraint, not proximity. When her work led to difficult conversations with senior staff, Lucas backed her decisions publicly while letting her lead the discussions herself. It was his way of saying he trusted her judgment without turning it into a spectacle. Emily felt the pressure of visibility, but also the relief of being valued for her mind rather than her situation. For the first time in years, she wasn't apologizing for needing flexibility or hiding parts of her life to seem reliable. Her confidence grew, not because life became easier, but because she felt respected. She noticed how Lucas treated everyone the same, from executives to interns, and that consistency made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. Kindness, she realized, didn't have to be loud to be real. Lucas, on his side, found himself re-engaging with his company in a way he hadn't in years. Seeing Emily challenge outdated decisions reminded him why he had built the business in the first place. It wasn't just about profit or control, but about creating something that lasted beyond his own presence. He felt pride again, not in himself, but in the environment he was slowly reshaping. That pride felt cleaner than ambition ever had. Despite their growing connection, Lucas kept a deliberate distance outside of work. He avoided late-night messages, unnecessary meetings, and personal invitations, understanding the fragile balance they were maintaining. Emily noticed the restraint and respected it, even when part of her wondered what might happen if the boundaries softened. The space between them wasn't empty. It was intentional. An intention, she was learning, could be a form of care. As months passed, both of them began to feel the weight of unspoken possibilities. Their connection had deepened through shared effort, trust, and mutual respect, but neither had named what hovered between them. Lucas knew that protecting Emily's independence mattered more than satisfying his own curiosity. Emily knew that crossing certain lines could undo everything she had rebuilt. And still, the question lingered quietly, waiting for the moment neither of them could ignore it anymore. The moment Lucas realized his life had quietly shifted didn't come during a dramatic meeting or a public win for the company, but on an ordinary afternoon when he watched Emily present a financial review to the executive team. She spoke with clarity and calm authority, explaining difficult decisions without apology or hesitation. The room listened in a way Lucas hadn't seen in years, not because of fear or hierarchy, but because her reasoning made sense. When the meeting ended, the silence was followed by respect rather than debate. Lucas felt something settle inside him, a recognition that went beyond professional admiration. Later that evening, Lucas found himself replaying the day on his drive home, noticing how different it felt to be proud of someone else's growth rather than his own achievements. For years, success had been measured in dollars, expansion, and control, but none of that had felt as grounding as watching Emily stand firmly in her place. He realized he trusted her in a way that didn't require oversight or reassurance. That trust, once given, changed the way he saw both his company and himself. It wasn't about losing authority, but about sharing responsibility. Emily, meanwhile, sat alone in her apartment after putting her son to bed, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. The day had drained her in the best possible way, the kind of exhaustion that comes from using your mind fully rather than surviving emotionally. She thought about how far she had come in a year, not just professionally, but internally. For the first time since her marriage ended, she felt capable rather than reactive. That feeling mattered more to her than recognition. The following week, a minor crisis tested everything they had built. A discrepancy surfaced that could have led to serious losses if handled poorly, and pressure mounted quickly from outside partners. Lucas could have stepped in and taken control, but he didn't. Instead, he asked Emily how she wanted to approach it and stood back as she laid out a clear, ethical plan. Her solution wasn't the fastest, but it was the most honest, and Lucas backed it fully. The decision paid off, not just financially, but culturally, sending a message through the company that integrity mattered more than shortcuts. Employees noticed the shift, feeling safer to speak up and question old habits. Emily felt the weight of leadership without the isolation she had feared. She wasn't being carried, she was being trusted, and that trust anchored her in ways she hadn't expected. One evening after work, Lucas found Emily still at her desk, reviewing numbers long after most people had left. He offered to walk her out, not as her boss, but as someone who recognized shared exhaustion. They talked about small things on the way to the elevator, about her son's school project and his attempts to cook meals that didn't end in disappointment. The simplicity of the conversation felt intimate without crossing a line. Standing in the lobby, they paused longer than necessary, both aware of the unspoken connection between them. Lucas told her he respected the way she handled pressure and that the company was better because of her presence. Emily thanked him, not with excitement but with sincerity, acknowledging that his trust had given her room to breathe again. The moment wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was deeply personal. Something between them solidified, quiet but undeniable. As they went their separate ways that night, both carried the same realization without naming it. Their lives were no longer moving on parallel tracks. They were connected by choice, respect, and shared values, not need or escape. And while neither of them knew what that connection would become, they both felt the weight of it growing, waiting for the moment it would demand a decision. The real test didn't come from inside the company, but from the world outside it, where choices were rarely clean and consequences never waited. Emily's ex-husband reappeared unexpectedly, not to ask for reconciliation, but to renegotiate responsibilities he had abandoned when things became difficult. The conversation reopened wounds Emily thought she had already closed, forcing her to confront the imbalance she had carried alone for too long. Lucas didn't interfere or take sides, but he noticed the strain immediately. He understood that healing wasn't linear, and growth often invited old pain back into the room. At the same time, pressure from the board increased as the company's recent ethical shifts slowed short-term profits. Some executives questioned whether Emily's influence had softened the business too much, framing integrity as inefficiency. Lucas found himself standing at a familiar crossroads, where compromise promised comfort and conviction demanded courage. He listened to the criticism carefully, knowing that leadership meant absorbing doubt without passing it down the line. Protecting Emily wasn't the goal. Protecting the value she represented was. Emily felt torn between pride and fear as whispers reached her desk. She worried that her presence might become a liability rather than an asset, not because of her work, but because of what she symbolized. The weight of being seen as different pressed heavily on her, reminding her of past moments when she had been asked to shrink for the sake of harmony. She considered whether stepping back would make things easier for everyone involved. The thought of leaving again, this time on uncertain terms, scared her more than she expected. Lucas invited Emily to a private conversation, not in his office, but in a neutral space that felt human rather than hierarchical. He acknowledged the tension without assigning blame and asked her how she was holding up. Emily spoke honestly about her doubts, her fears, and her exhaustion from always having to prove she belonged. Lucas listened, resisting the urge to reassure her with empty promises. Instead, he told her that leadership sometimes meant being uncomfortable long enough for others to catch up. That conversation shifted something between them. Emily realized that Lucas wasn't just offering professional support, but emotional steadiness without expectation. He wasn't asking her to stay for him or to leave for the company. He was asking her to decide for herself, free from pressure. That freedom felt unfamiliar and powerful at the same time. For the first time, she felt trusted not only with responsibility, but with choice. Weeks later, Lucas made a public decision that clarified everything. He backed Emily's long-term strategy in front of the board, fully aware of the financial implications. The choice sent a message that values were not negotiable, even when inconvenient. Some investors pushed back, others walked away, but those who stayed understood the direction clearly. The company changed, not overnight, but deliberately. Emily watched the shift with mixed emotions, understanding the cost